Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. This show is brought to you by Flatirons Tuning, your source for any aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts. Be sure to check out our store at flatirons.tuning.com and stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning. Hey folks, welcome back to Flatirons Syndicate. We're here today to answer your questions about rally suspension. I've got in front of me here, this is a front and a rear Cusco Zero 3G set that we're testing on the GR WRX and STI. And then this here is an RS&SP that we've actually never run this specific strut, but we used to run these a suspension just like this on our rally car, and we're currently running Rikers on our rally car. So I'm going to go through and answer all your questions. Before I do that, what I thought we should do is have just a quick discussion about rally suspension, just kind of about some of the basic things, and then I think some of the answers to these questions are going to make more sense down the road. The first thing is just to show you what the difference is between a conventional strut and an inverted strut. Okay, and I'm going to say to the folks at home, and if you're listening to this podcast on audio, I apologize because there's going to be some shuffling of the struts here occasionally, but I'll try and keep that to a minimum, so apologies in advance. All right, so we all know what a standard strut looks like, and so that's like this rear strut here, where you basically have the strut body that goes down, connects to the bottom, to the knuckle of the car, whatnot. And then you have this little shaft, and you can kind of see it here if I can get this dust shield to come up, where you have kind of a small shaft. You know, this one is somewhat thick, but that goes up, connects to the top hat, basically connects to the top of the car. Now, when you look at this, and if you think where the majority of the weight of the strut would be, well, it's in the body. It's in the lower section, and there's not nearly as much weight in the shaft and going up to the top hat. So this is a conventional strut. A lot of the rally suspension utilizes inverted struts, which like this one here, and you can see. Ooh, there it is. All right, you can see that the strut body is much thicker than the conventional strut, because this is actually where the gas and the oil is. There is a shaft that goes down, but it goes down here. So you have the majority of the weight of the strut itself is up top, and it's connected to the car, and the light section, just the shaft itself, basically goes down and connects to the knuckle. So this is reducing your unsprung weight. Worth noting here that this outer sleeve, there's basically just more stability in these as well. So you're putting more of the weight up, connected to the car, and more of the weight is not moving; it's stationary. But then also you have this extra thick strut body that's moving up and down. So there's a lot more rigidity in an inverted strut versus a conventional strut, and that's a big part of where that type of a strut is an advantage in a rally car, especially if the rally car has McPherson suspension. So McPherson suspension on the front or on the back, or both. Where, in terms of thinking of McPherson suspension, I brought out this handy dandy rally tool. Every good rally team needs a good hammer, but when we're talking about suspension and unsprung weight and that sort of thing, this is a good visual to keep in mind. If you think of the head of the hammer, the heavy part, that's your wheel and tire and brake and everything like that. And then basically the arm of the hammer, that's your suspension linkage. So, if we're driving a rally car down a rough road or whatnot, this hammer, the weight, the wheel and tire and the brakes and everything like that, that's going to be moving up and down. Now, McPherson suspensions, that's like the front suspension on basically all the WRXs and STIs. If this is your wheel and tire and all that, the McPherson suspension is holding that hammer right here. So my arm would be the strut, and then it connects to the top of the car here. Why would you want that? Well, because the strut and spring assembly is connected right to where all the action is happening, where the weight is. And so you have direct control, and there's a very linear relationship to the spring rate and the valving and everything like that, to controlling the weight of the wheel and tire as it's moving, as it's trying to soak up the bumps and all that sort of thing. When you have a multi-link suspension like the rear on the GR, WRX, and STI, and basically all the WRXs and STIs since from 2008 and on, the knuckle is connected to an upper and a lower control arm, And the strut and spring, like this guy, is set inboard on that rear suspension linkage. So there's a leverage factor that's happening here. And the strut and spring is still connected to the car, but further inboard. And it is not now a structural member. So like on a McPherson suspension where it's connected right out at the end, right out to the knuckle, the reason that this rigidity matters is because it is a structural member of the suspension. This strut needs to be strong because it is holding and is connected directly to this the knuckle and the wheel and tire as it's moving up and down. It is a direct. It has direct control of how that knuckle moves. That's why, when we talk about adding caster and whatnot, changing the angle of this strut, that has a big impact on how the suspension moves because it's has a direct connection to the wheel and tire, the heavy part that's moving. The multi-links, because it's connected inboard, the upper and the lower control arm and the trailing arm, those are the things that have direct control over how the knuckle, wheel, and tire moves. The strut and spring is just kind of slowing down or trying to control the movement. With this leverage, the advantage of that is that, basically it's kind of like you have a better mechanical advantage, so it ends up being a little bit smoother in certain circumstances. But in the case of a rally suspension, the issue is, like, one of the things you're sacrificing by moving the strut and spring inboard is the control. Like if my arm controls here, this is a fairly heavy rally tool, so it takes a lot more force for me to control the movement of this hammerhead if I'm grabbing it, even just this far in. If I have it here, it's much easier. The suspension has the same problem. So it's like the suspension can move more smoothly, but it's a lot harder to control and slow down the movement of the wheel and tire. The other thing is, oftentimes, because you're more inboard and the suspension slopes up, whatever, you're in a much smaller space, it's much smaller. So you can, I guess one of the advantages for like a road car is you can have, you can run a higher spring rate, and you can have a smaller damper that is able to kind of do the job of controlling the rear suspension on a road car. But in a rally car, that smaller suspension, that smaller damper, that can become a problem because you lose travel. That's the other thing, is with a multi-link where you have this upper and lower arm that have to move together. A lot of times you just don't have the overall travel, the same movement that the rear suspension is capable of compared to a McPherson, where by and large, as long as the lower control arm can move in a sweeping motion, really the length of travel of the strut is what controls how much travel you have in the front. Like there are certainly some limitations, but there's a lot more latitude with the McPherson. So like, if you followed the podcast for a while, you've heard Tasso say that, the last real performance car that Subaru made was the 2007 WRX STI. Well, it's because that's the last generation that still had the McPherson suspension front and rear. So there's a lot of advantages to having a car with that type of suspension to go out there and run rally. Now, can it be done with the multi-link rears? It can be. But all the real big serious guys like Subaru rally teams and whatnot, the first thing that they did with the multi-links was basically remove that and convert it to a McPherson rear suspension. So with all of that out of the way, I think this will make some of the answers to these questions make a little bit more sense. But if they spark new questions, obviously leave them in the comments below, and I'm sure we'll probably circle back and talk about this again. Okay, so first question here is from Sean Maybe 1609. Budget-friendly coilovers, suggested ride height. Any suspension geometry corrections, how to make suspension more reliable, brakes for the smaller wheels, etc. So good point here about the brakes. So the biggest rally tires out there are 15-inch tires, so for 15-inch wheels. So to fit underneath 15-inch wheel, you have to have somewhat smaller brakes. And so the default is basically the Subaru 2-pot and 4-pot calipers, like the red ones that you saw in the 2006, 2007 WRX. Those fit underneath 15-inch brakes well, and they give you plenty of stopping power. That's what we've used for years and years. With those smaller wheels, your tires are going to be smaller if you're running, the full-on rally tires. And you really, the more you're driving on dirt, for stage rally, for hill climbs on dirt, I think you really need rally tires. For rally cross, where it's lower speeds, you could probably get away with something like a snow tire. The problem with anything other than an actual rally tire is the sidewall thickness of the tires are going to be much, much softer, and so it's a lot easier to debead the tire. Like you're sliding the car, you dip a tire into the rut, and so the rut kind of pushes against the sidewall, and it just pops off the bead, the tire deflates. Worst case scenario, and this has definitely happened to friends of the shop through the years, is that the tire debeads, and then the hard rim digs into the dirt, and then that sends the car up and over. Like when Tasso rolled his red rally car, to a certain extent, that's kind of what looks like happened, is that the wheel, or the tire debeaded, the wheel dug in, and just with enough momentum, the car just went, side over side or end over end. So that's the thing you got to watch out for. For budget-friendly coilovers, there's some more questions about rally suspension. I guess maybe at this point at the very beginning, what I will say is that for just generally speaking, budget-friendly coilovers, I think like the best performing coilover for the money is something like a Feel 441. Not for anything to do with dirt, but just in general. They started about $1,400. Feel does an awesome job with their valving. Their valving is like superior to many suspensions out there. They have a lot of good spring rates, a lot of good options for Subarus especially, and that's kind of like that's the benchmark. It's very easy to go with a coilover that's maybe a couple $100 less, but it's not going to ride nearly as well. It's not going to last nearly as long. I think if you really want to go with coilovers, something in that $1,400 to $1,600 budget is what you really probably want to try and budget for, if at all possible. Anything less than that, I would say probably stick with something like a Tian, because they're a big company. They've been making suspension forever. They use really high quality components. Something like that. That's going to be your best bet. But there, even with a $800-900 set of Tians, there can be some ride quality, dampening quality, and whatnot that you're just kind of missing out on. For ride height, generally, you could certainly make Subarus lower, but kind of the sweet spot for Subarus is about 1 inch to maybe 1.5 inches lower than stock. Anything more than that, and then there's you start getting into some pretty significant geometry issues that you're creating. This is where running a roll center just kit comes into play. The taller ball joints, we made a video about that. That's where you really need to start looking at just putting in those taller ball joints in the roll center correction to get the suspension to work properly. For gravel, basically I think that the best option right now for gravel suspension are these Cusco Zero 3Gs, which is why we're working with Cusco to try and make them more available. That's why we're trying to get through testing them on the GR chassis to make them available for that chassis. We have them now for the GD chassis. They are expensive. They're about $3,500, but it's something that is, you have the spring rates and the valving and the durability if you're going to really start running the car on gravel and dirt and rough surfaces, that it's going to hold up and it's going to work properly. It's going to actually give you, good suspension performance. Whereas like if you took a tarmac coilover and tried to run it on dirt, like it will kind of do it. It'll work okay-ish, but like just the durability is not there, and man, it's going to just be way too high spring rates. So we'll get into more details with that going forward. Okay, so this next question. Maxwell Duff 4958. I use my my 05 WRX daily currently on stock struts and springs, and I love the versatility of railing on the canyons, gravel roads. It has good enough clearance when my adventure takes me that way. However, a stiffer and more robust stock ride height option would be nice. Looking at Kona Yellows, KYB AGXs with a stiffer spring, what would be good things to consider? And kind of what we're looking for here, it sounds like, is a budget rallycross setup. I would say, like, if you can go with something like an AGX or even the Teen Enduro Pro Plus, so it's a stock replacement strut that gives you a little bit of a valving adjustment, and then stay with your stock springs. like as a good starting point, I think that would be fair. The Teen Enduro Pro Pluses, and it has to be the Plus, those are the ones that have the adjustable valving. What's wild is they actually put hydraulic bump stops in those. So there's a few local guys that run rallycross, and they've put those on their car, and have been really happy with them. So for budget rallycross, I would say that that's a good place to start. You might well outgrow it. If you're really starting to push and go fast and slide the car a lot, or if wherever you're doing rallycross, it's, pretty rough roads, that might not be enough dampening and enough dampening adjustment for you. But that would be a good option. The Conies, I don't know how they would work off-road, honestly. Anything that you've got an adjustable valving, it's a start. But yeah, I guess you certainly could try it. But just because of the hydraulic bump stops, I'd probably look at those Teen Enduro Pro Pluses. Yeah, and again, keeping it, if you're staying with stock struts and springs, to keep it stock ride height, I think that's definitely the right way to go. Yeah. Okay. Next question here, the JM Penny. So how hard is it to rebuild? How often do you need to maintain a rally suspension? What's the best bang for the buck setup for starting in rally? And at what point do you start looking to upgrade? Great questions. There's a lot here. There's some commonality between these questions. I tried to kind of like stack them together. The bang for the buck is definitely a common theme for trying to get something for off-road suspension for rally. And it's hard because you need something that has more capability, that has more durability, because you're going to be really beating it up. And then the question to how often do you rebuild it? That's definitely going to depend. One of the things that the difference here between, like, let's say a set of like Teen Enduro Pro Pluses versus like the Cusco Zero 3Gs versus like something like this RS and SP. When we were running the RS and SPs and we were doing 6 ARA rallies a year, we probably should have got them rebuilt every season. What we actually did is I think we went and got them rebuilt usually about every other season, or if we started to have and noticed that we were having an issue, which wasn't that often. I think we had them rebuilt maybe twice, and the set that we have out now trying to get rebuilt, it's because we rolled the car with them. So obviously that bends things, that damages things, and you gotta get them rebuilt when that happens. But it's a very expensive, like, motorsports grade rally setup, but the durability is like massive. With something like an Enduro Pro Plus, I mean, it would be possible that, like, especially the harder you're driving, the more ruts that you're hitting, the rougher the terrain. I mean, it's something where you might end up needing to replace front struts a couple times a season. I mean, they're something like that is really affordable, and that's not really going to break the bank. And it's something where you would just replace it. You wouldn't ever try to rebuild it. But going up to something like the Zero 3Gs with an inverted front strut, that's going to give you more consistent steering feel. Like we talked about at the beginning with the stiffer inverted strut, it's just going to hold that knuckle and wheel assembly more firmly, more consistently as you're going through the rough stuff. So that certainly helps, and it's the components that Cusco is using are a much higher grade, and so this is something where you would probably rebuild it, and you're going to get some good life out of it. I would say with something like the Zero 3G, if you're doing just like rally crosses, definitely, probably like we had done once a year, once every other year, you'd need to send it in, or you'd want to send it in, get it rebuilt. For stage rally, this is something where I think these suspensions can do stage rally, and in Japan, there's a lot of people that are running club rally with the Zero 3Gs. It'll definitely hold up to it, but it's something that you're going to want to watch out for, just for any kind of signs of wear or anything like that, and to get them rebuilt or replaced. Let's see. The point at which you would start to look at rebuilding. There's another question in here. Let's see. Well, I'll answer it here in more, and maybe we'll dive into it in more detail. One of the biggest things with rally suspension is moving from using using a cam bolt to set the camber versus a shim. And you can kind of see it here, and I'll try and get a picture of it. The real high-end rally suspensions, you don't use a cam lobe and a cam bolt that you turn to kind of set the camber. You're actually putting in a shim that has, like, the hole basically moves. And so you have a locked shim on both sides of the strut, so that when you put in that bolt, that alignment setting, that is fixed. You can, hit rocks, take jumps, it's not going to move. That's the biggest thing. Years and years ago, we were running some DMS 50s. I think they now run a shim, or the more current ones run shims. But back, they were old in the olden days. They were like the Cuscos, where you just ran a stock camber bolt. And the problem is that you can run into a situation where you can actually start to wallow out the holes in the actual ears of the strut that go to the knuckle. And you go out and you have your suspension set. You go out, you come back, and the wheels are all tipped in, or one of them is tipped in and tipped out, and you have to kind of do a quick eyeball camber adjustment before you send the car back out in service. When you start to have to really fight with the alignment, or you get inconsistencies in alignment, again, that could be an indicator that the lower bracket needs to be replaced. It could be an indicator that the whole suspension needs to be redone. And the more that you start fighting with that, if you're driving, again, over a lot of rough stuff, that's where, like, going up to a full rally, motorsports rally suspension that has those shims, I mean, that can be a game changer, because you're going to get a lot more consistent suspension performance. The other thing is volume of, well, I guess it'd be volume of the strut itself and the adjustment. So usually you're just going to have a single adjustable suspension, which you're just adjusting rebound only. So that's what the 03Gs are. Like if you go with something like an Enduro Pro Plus, rebound only. Even the Rigers that we're running right now on the rally car, it's only a rebound adjustment that we can do basically with the clicker on the fly. The RSNSPs, they are three-way adjustable. So you have fast compression, slow compression, and rebound that are all adjustable. And front and rear all have external reservoirs, like you can see here. So the volume of oil in the strut is much, much larger than basically just a single-bodied strut with no reservoir. And so what that gives you is a lot more ability to fine-tune the handling of the car and how the suspension works. You can actually make adjustments with the fast compression and slow compression to adapt to conditions a little bit more. If it's a dry rally on rough surfaces versus wet and muddy, soften things up, stiffen things up, that sort of thing. That's a big advantage. And like if you're doing more and more stage rallies, long stages, where the suspension is going to be working very hard for longer and longer durations of time. That's where having the volume of the external reservoir comes in, because it helps keep the fluid, the oil in the strut cool. And so that gives you more consistent performance from beginning to end of stage, or stage after stage. And so if you start to run into situations where you don't have the adjustment that you really want to kind of optimize your setup, or if you're starting to get the feeling that like the car starts to feel really bouncy towards the end of a stage, or after like 2 or 3 stages, and you can actually get, put your hand, well, I don't know if I'd put my hand down, but get an infrared temperature gun and like see what temperatures the strut bodies and stuff are getting up to. If they're getting really, really hot, it's certainly possible that you just need the extra volume to kind of keep everything cool, to keep that consistent valving performance through the stages, through the rally use. Also possible to send them out to get rebuilt. Maybe a thicker, heavier weight oil might be an option. Those are some of the performance indicators that would say, okay, maybe it's really time to go up to a real motorsports grade suspension. The kicker is that, like as expensive as it sounds, like for a set of 03Gs at $3,500, like a motorsports grade rally suspension, they kind of start now at $7,000 and go up from there. You could pretty easily spend $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 on a set of motorsports grade rally suspension. There are absolutely a lot of good options out there when you get into that price point, but that's a pretty hefty price point. So like, again, budget-friendly options was a theme in a lot of these questions. And so like, even as expensive as it might sound to spend $3,500 on the 03Gs, I mean, that is kind of a budget-friendly option. I mean, to have potentially 2 sets of these for 1 set of these, like even if you have to kind of rotate through and get them rebuilt after 3 or 4 events, maybe that's still reasonable and cost effective, and or to have a full backup set, because you cannot underestimate how helpful it is to have a backup set of suspension. We've wished that we would have had that multiple times. So if you spend everything on top dollar best suspension, but you have no backup, I mean, that can be potentially an issue, and you could certainly make an argument that if it becomes an issue, you'd be better off to just, call it on that rally and not keep pushing. But there you go. So as far as when to upgrade, I think that's a good set of guidelines to think of, and we might come back to some of these other questions. Okay, next, Bluebug 02. What else with the suspension needs attention? What are the weak points, structural, etc.? Considering the ride height might be even higher than stock, does going into full droop have any effects or negative side effects in terms of wear or the other components that need more regular attention and replacement? Great question. Everything I would say on a rally car is a wear component. And I do mean everything. I mean, even almost the chassis itself. In terms of the suspension, that's definitely the case. Usually, what we've always favored is to run the steel components versus aluminum components. There are some people that I know that really like the aluminum control arms better than the steel ones. The idea behind the steel ones is that if you do have an impact and it bends, it will bend, and you could potentially bend it back and it won't snap, and it's something where you could, like, say you're going through a stage, you have an impact, you bend the control arm and you have an issue. Well, you can get to the end of that stage. There's the rally alignment, if you will, where you take like a tow rope and you wrap it around the bent control arm in a tree, and you kind of back the car up to kind of bend it back to the point where the wheel is more or less centered in the wheel well, so you can then drive on it, maybe get through the next stage, drive on the road, get back to service, and then replace it. Aluminum has a tendency to snap instead of bend, so that's kind of what you want to watch out for. But again, I do know that some people prefer the aluminum ones because they feel like they're a little bit more durable. Sometimes the concern is that maybe the steel front control arms, rear lateral links, etc., bend a little bit too easily. So I mean, it's something where you kind of have to get out there and just kind of start running the events and see what you think. Just even gravel will wear lots of stuff out. I mean, you need Under Armour for the car, but you'd be amazed, like the trailing arms on a rally car. A lot of times the ears at the front, they will just get eroded by gravel getting shot out from the tires underneath. So you really have to inspect every piece of the suspension for wear and for damage. A lot of times, I mean, you can be going around and like you're bouncing around between so much rough stuff. Sometimes, like, you could have something bent and you wouldn't even know it until you maybe put the car in alignment rack and actually like get a reading of where you're at. So like everything is a potential wear component, and to that end, like that's where running the steel things and having multiple spares and checking it in service is really important. We usually try and keep at least one, if not two, backup sets of each control arm and each set of lateral links, because like it really does happen more often than you would think. And by Murphy's Law, if you've got like three lefts and only one right, you're going to probably hit the right all through the rally, and you won't even touch the left. That's just kind of the way it usually works out. Structural maintenance, you have to look at the strut tops, where the strut tops connect to the chassis, where they go into the firewall. Got to keep an eye open for cracks, because again, rally cars, they're taking a lot of abuse. They're going over a lot of rough stuff. Their cracks could develop, in the fenders where the strut tops and whatnot go in. If you see anything like that it's starting to develop, you definitely want to get it re-welded, corrected as soon as possible. This is where if you have a rally car with a cage where the cage can go in and kind of gusset or support the strut tops, that definitely helps, just because of the amount of abuse that the suspension is going to go through. Anything you can do to kind of protect the suspension components from that gravel spray that I was talking about, that helps a lot. That would be a really good idea. Not just, mud flaps, obviously, pretty much every rally event requires mud flaps, but something like that, some kind of a plastic shield or plastic cover for a lot of these suspension components is a great idea. As far as ride height goes, there's not really much of an issue that you would run into. You just want to make sure that nothing is binding up more than anything. And that's just something where you kind of you'll get a sense for that as you run the car, or if you've got it up in the air and you can kind of move the suspension around, without the strut connected or something like that. Just keep an eye on that. It's brakes, but I'll mention it here. Rear brake calipers. So in the rear, for whatever reason, it is very common for the Subaru two-pots to kind of get a lot of wear, especially if you're driving in wet conditions where there's a lot of mud that gets packed into the wheel. That basically can turn into basically sandpaper or whatnot, and it can kind of grind through the top of the rear calipers. And what can happen in a worst case is you wear all of that down, and the oil or the brake fluid that goes through the caliper runs close to the top of the caliper there, and that can wear down a hole, and you can lose all your brake fluid. If that happens, and then all of a sudden you can run out of brakes. So always look at the tops of your rear brake calipers and replace them as needed. One of the reasons that they wear down so frequently is because the front calipers of the Subaru 2-pots and 4-pots are cast iron, but the rears are aluminum, so they're just a little bit more vulnerable. Okay, so and if you've got any more questions about wear items or whatnot, definitely leave them in the comments below, but those are, I think, the high points there. Akiva Pilot asked the question, how do you know what to prioritize, travel or dampening? That is a good question. I will just speak from our experience, and I'm sure that there's other people that maybe would lean one way or another, but I would say from what we've seen that travel is really, really important. If you have the best dampening but you don't have enough travel, that can be a problem. And I'll use ourselves as an example. When we were playing with setting the riders up, what we realized is there's something going on there, but the long and the short of it is that to get the car to look like it was level on the ground as it was sitting, it turns out that we had raised the rear of the car up too much to do that, and we had gotten rid of all of the travel, the droop travel on the car. So where we noticed this, I think there's a video or something where we showed this. We had the car in the shop and it was on the lift, and we just put it up, and I realized just go up like the littlest amount, and all of a sudden the rear tires come off the ground. With a rally car, it's easy to kind of picture jumps and stuff like that where the car would need to use a lot of travel to absorb an impact. But the thing that's often overlooked is that, as the car is going down the road and it's a rough surface, to keep the tires in contact with the road, a lot of times you have to have a lot of droop travel so that, if the tire goes into a dip, the tire can stay in contact with the road and you can keep traction. And the problem that we were running into with the suspension with that suspension issue I was just mentioning was they brought the car back from an event, and they actually thought that the rear diff had failed and was not working because the rear traction was so bad. And once we saw that there was no droop travel, what we realized is, the diff was fine. I mean, in the initial testing, appeared that the diff was fine as well. But what we realized what was happening is because there was no ability for the rear tires to droop down and stay in contact with the road on uneven surfaces, effectively the rear of the car was just skeetering along the top of the road, and it was losing connection with the road all the time. And that's why it felt like the car just had no grip back there and was sliding around all the time. Well, because it was, and it was because there's just no travel. So you really need as much travel as you can get out of the car from the suspension to keep everything in contact with the road, so you have a good amount of control that you're working with. Dampening, it will come, but I think if the car is a little bit bouncy, that's easier to work around versus if you don't have enough travel. And that's, again, where in the rear suspension on the GRs where you have the multi-link, that's where that becomes a lot more of a challenge than in the fronts. So I would lean towards travel, but if you feel differently, definitely let me know in the comments here. KDow's 934 asks, is fluid a closely guarded secret for each team? I don't think so. I mean, I honestly am not 100% sure exactly what fluid is in each of our struts, and maybe I should know that. Again, we don't usually rebuild them a ton, and so it's not something that we're playing with. Could you play around with it and find something that works better in certain conditions? Absolutely. I think that's certainly possible. I think that more than fluid, the valving settings themselves would probably be more of somebody's secret sauce than the fluid, but the two do go hand in hand. And that's where, if you're really going to, if you, for the beginning, I mean, we're working with somebody at Cusco to set these up that's got a lot of experience, and they seem to be working well so far. But the more you want to get to the pointy end, like that's again, we're going up to a higher and higher grade of a motorsports suspension. You're probably going to be working with somebody that's got more and more experience of trying a lot of things and setting things up for various different events, various different conditions, and they can probably guide you through a lot more of that as you're starting out and you're just trying to get out there and have fun and go to a few events, or even complete your first season or two. Like that's probably um, more involved than you really need to get. There's just so much more going on with rally, that I'd say you don't want to go down that path of tinkering with something like that too much at the beginning, because there's just so much more. There's so many more challenges just to get to the end of the event that you're going to have to battle with. Like back to Blue Bug O2's question about wear items and stuff like that. It's challenging just to get to the end of a rally. Period. I mean, we DNF'd at a Jibway just last weekend, because we were having issues with axles. Anything you could think of has caught us out through the years. There's so much to know about, like what spares to bring, and even just learning how to drive to save the car or to keep the car going. What is important to address in a service? Tires. How and when do you rotate tires? Like how important are new tires? Um, Keeping the car like cool and reliable running. There's just so many pieces of that puzzle that it's like once you get to the point where you can consistently finish events, you know exactly what the spares are. You've got a good routine for getting through your services. You kind of like you get to the point where you can kind of picture like everything that you need to bring for the event, how all of the services are going to go, what you're going to really focus on, and get comfortable with dealing with the unknowns, because man, there's just so many surprises that happen in the course of a rally. And you get comfortable with that, and the ability to diagnose the issues with the car. Again, have the spares that you need to get the car back together in the service and keep going. That's where, once you get all of that under your belt and you feel really comfortable with that, and then what that should bring is consistency, and you're getting a lot more finishes. And then that's where you can really start to focus on things that optimize the speed of the car, like really fine-tuning the suspension in that way, really fine-tuning the power delivery, the drivetrain, those sorts of things. I would say probably like getting comfortable with the routine of the rally first, then getting all the diffs in place like we talked about in the diff video, then worrying about, and then the third step there would be kind of power and suspension, and probably suspension first, then power, because the suspension, you've got to have the grip to be able to use the power. If you have more power than you can handle with the suspension setup that you've got, then it's not doing you as many favors as you would like. So that would be the order that I would think of. And KDL's 934 had another question about full droop events, like a huge jump. Is there anything different with the suspension, like Baja style bypass or anything like that? You get up into the fancier suspensions, sure. Again, high speed and low speed compression, different valvings for those things. Bigger strut bodies, more travel. These guys, like if you watch any of the Dirtfish or Subaru rally videos, and you see them just put the Subaru rally cars up in the air, I would guess that they're probably getting 12 to 15 inches of suspension travel out of these cars now. Everything is custom. Like everything is custom on the suspensions of those cars, but huge amounts of travel. Like on the GDs in the front, I think we can get like 8 inches of travel, and in the rear like 9 or 10 inches maybe of the GD, WRX, and STIs. And that's just with everything being stock. So I mean, they're getting huge amounts of travel, and so that's where things get fancy. A lot of times, like jumps look really cool, but they're actually pretty dangerous, as you could imagine. And like I remember when they started bringing rallycross in, and they wanted some of the rally guys to go out and compete in the rallycross. Like this is when they first started bringing rally to the X Games, and they would always have the jump, like the crossover jump. And a lot of the rally guys that went out there and did it, they started referring to that jump as the car killer. There was more than one person that had some kind of an issue going over that jump where they took it too fast, too slow, shorted it, went too long, and I mean, completely wrecked cars because they're going over this big jump. I mean, there's a ton involved to get a car to the point where it can go over that kind of a span and absorb that kind of an impact consistently. For us more privateers, the wiser thing when you see big jumps like that is to kind of slow down, like be really careful, really conservative, so that catch a little bit of air maybe, but you're not going to risk everything and risk all the damage you could potentially do to the car by going over the jump and having that big impact if you don't have all the crazy fancy suspension that some of the factory teams and stuff do. I mean, there's so much there that can go wrong just from the impact, certainly. But like if something happens with the launch where the car kind of is turned and you kind of nose down, and like a lot of that impact goes into one corner, yeah, it can get bad quickly. So you've got to kind of keep that in mind as you're running these events. It's really easy to kind of look at what the big guys are doing and want to do that, but rally is such a war of attrition. It's like really, if you finish a rally, you're going to be in the top 50%. Like it is that challenging, and sometimes it's not even 50% of the cars that finish. So really, like that is the challenge. It's not being able to go out there and drive really, really fast on dirt roads and slide the car a ton. Those are certainly parts of rally, but a lot of actually getting out there and running rally is about figuring out how to drive the car, carry reasonable speed, but actually get the car to the end. Like just getting the car to the end is a challenge that you cannot overlook how significant it is. Okay, last couple here. All right, so kind of similar to the last one, Jets Corp asked, how does rally suspension deal with big bumps and relatively limited travel, especially on compression? For example, I have Öhlins on my Miata that have awesome body control and deal with chatter very well, but bigger hits, i.e. Like a speed bump, send the car airborne even from disturbingly low speeds. My truck is on Bilsteins and can blitz big hits with ease, but uses copious amounts of travel to do it and has the body control of a forklift as a result. What are rally cars doing with their dampening curves and spring rates to get the car like ride heights but still take bumps like a truck? So more specifically, I guess the answer is we're finding ways to put in the relatively limited travel that a rally car has, to put more and more capable suspension that can kind of maximize what the stock suspension can do in the movement that it has. But there are certainly limitations. So it's like, I guess it's back to the previous point. The rally cars can do things like that, but it's within reason. And if you really push it and you go too big, then bad things can still happen. But I guess to maybe answer this more specifically, what they're doing is we're going with a wider strut body. Like the thicker we can get the strut body, the larger the piston is, the more volume of oil there's going to be, even in a strut like this where there's no external reservoir. For spring rates, what we're doing is really rally cars usually are using spring rates that are about in the ballpark of what the stock springs are, or potentially even a little bit softer. And there's different schools of thought there. There seems to be more people leaning towards actually even using softer spring rates now. So you're getting, the car is going to be even more and more willing to move, and so that kind of gives you more weight transfer. You can play around with that. Again, the softer spring rates to get you more weight transfer, to get the traction up to the front so that the car can slide and initiate that all. But then, like what we've kind of found with our driver, like with the Rigers that we're running now are a little bit softer spring rates. The RSNSPs, we're running stiffer spring rates, and I think he prefers the stiffer spring rates compared to the softer ones. So if you're more comfortable with the stiffer spring rates, then you're going to have a little bit less movement. The ride's going to be a little bit harsher, but like you're going to be a little bit better able to kind of deal with, some of those smaller bumps. Like the car's not going to move quite as much, and you're able to kind of like transfer the load side to side versus front to back a little bit better. So the valving, the fluid that goes into the struts, the size of the struts, and then like the external reservoirs, so that you've got a lot of extra volume. Playing around with the high speed and low speed compression once you get to the higher level makes a big difference there. Usually, I mean, it's all within reason. I mean, the cars, unless you get to that really high level where you've got 12 or 15 inches of suspension travel, like when you're just dealing with 8 or 9 inches, then that's where it's not going to absorb all of the bumps as much as you might like, and then that's the challenge, like with the GRs and the WRXs and STIs with the multi-link rears. The fronts can have the suspension travel, but the rears don't, and so then it's the front can be stable and give you good traction up front, but then the back just it doesn't have it. So that's where it can become a challenge. And so it's really trying to maximize, what the rally cars do is trying to maximize what you can do with the space that you have, with the components that you have for that rough stuff. And it can work reasonably well. And I think really what it is you have to get a feel for what the car can do and then drive the car within what the car can do. It's if you overdrive the car, if you try and push the car too much, take too much of a bump, go for too high of a launch like I was talking about earlier, then that's when things get bad, and you kind of have to kind of explore those limits, to be honest, to find out what they are so that you can then avoid them. And it's just learning what the components can do and what the setup of the car can do and can do reliably, and then how do you drive that as quickly as possible and as reliably as possible to get to the end. And then again, like once you've figured that out, then that's where you can know where the points are, where, okay, well, I need, like, you get to the point where you're finally say, okay, well, I got to get rid of this multi-link rear. Let's put a McPherson rear, get some more travel in the back, and maybe get it to be more like a GD, that sort of thing. And you just kind of have to figure it out from there. It's going to be different for each driver, each driving style, what your willingness is to kind of damage, rebuild, and break and replace between each event, that sort of thing. And this last question, kind of related to all this, and this will probably make a lot more sense now to answer now versus at the beginning. Be-More 8853. Which platform is best to start with for a first-timer in closest to stock form for rallycross and whatnot? Impreza, Forester, Legacy, Crosstrek, or Outback? So I am, for anything off-road, I'm a big proponent for a platform that has front and rear McPherson suspension for all of the reasons that we've talked about. There's going to be more higher level suspension options for the car. It's easier to get, especially the rear suspension, to work better on dirt with a McPherson suspension versus the multi-link. So I would actually scratch, the Legacy, the Crosstrek, and the Outback off entirely. Between the Impreza and the Forester, there are a couple of people running Foresters now, and it can work reasonably well, certainly. There's so much crossover in that, I would say, 2004 to 2008 Forester chassis between the WRX and STI, that a lot of those same options will work. The Forester is heavier, so you're going to be sacrificing a little bit of weight there, and it is a bit taller. It has more weight up top. So that's definitely a negative. Really, this is where the Impreza, this is why they made the Impreza's rally cars, is because it's smaller, it's lower, it's lighter than the Forester. The Forester has bigger wheel wells, and so you might be able to play with suspension there a little bit more. The other tricky thing with the Foresters is they have that body lift, the 1-inch body lift, to get some of the height, which I guess might work out okay or to your benefit slightly in terms of rally, but I think, I don't know, the weight penalty might be enough to again tip it back to the Impreza. I think I would probably lean towards the Impreza because it's a coupe. You're not going to have any of that rear glass, that rear weight. But I guess the other advantage for the Forester, other than possibly a little bit more suspension travel with that more rear weight, is it's going to be more 50-50 weight distribution. You might actually have an easier time getting the rear out. So I would say there's benefits to both. The Impreza is a much more common proven chassis, so that there's just going to be so much more support for the Impreza. But if you like the Forester, if you've got a Forester, if you've been rallycrossing a Forester and you love it and you just like the way that it handles, you like the way that it works, and you want to try and turn that into a stage rally car, yeah, again, there's people doing it. There's no reason not to. But I think just for the weight side of things, the Impreza would be a little bit of an advantage. For what it's worth, just for what it's worth, that weight consideration, like it doesn't maybe come into play in the beginning or maybe even in the middle of a rally career as you're trying to kind of compete in more events and find speed and whatnot. But when you get towards the end and you're really kind of looking for speed, like if you're considering going with a full, $10,000, $12,000 motorsports rally suspension, you've got all the fancy diffs and all that sort of thing, that's where weight is going to come into play. Like being able to save 100, 200 pounds in an Impreza chassis versus maybe an equivalent Forester chassis, that couple 100 pounds over an entire stage rally, I mean, that could be a few seconds difference. That might be what, where the Forester is held back and the Impreza does better. So hard to say exactly, but again, like just the Impreza, because of the lightweight and the support, the product options for doing rally, I would probably lean towards the Impreza over anything else. So I think that covers it. So hopefully that helps. Hopefully that answers some questions. It might have sparked some new ones. If you got more questions that you want to put in the comments below, absolutely do so. If we need to come back and make a second version of this, then we'll certainly do it. So yeah, thanks very much for listening. Thanks for your support as always. Yeah, be sure, I should say here at the end, for anybody that's still listening, in a couple of videos ago, we were asking to help us grow the channel and whatnot, and a lot of people suggested coming out with merch. Well, the merch shop is basically live. If you click the shop button on YouTube, there's things there. We've actually got a couple of cool shirts up there and a few other things. More in the works, more to come there, but just check it out. If you hear this, check out the shop. Let me know in the comments below what you think of what we've got up there now, and be sure to check back because we're going to add some more things here soon. So, yeah, thanks so much for your support as always, and until next time, stay tuned to Flatirons Tuning. Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. Once again, we'd like to let you know that your support is what makes this show possible. Be sure to check out our online store at flatirons.com for any of your aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts needs. And as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.